All right. Hey, HEMA Strong. So I'm answering a question regarded to how long should your longsword be? And very commonly, you'll see a link to a Guy Windsor article from 12 years ago. For clarity, Guy Windsor knows way more than I do. Uh, but that said, I don't know that if a 12-year-old resource it represents his current understanding. The cool thing about HEMA is that over time, hopefully, we look back and say, wow, I didn't know as much as I think I did, or I've changed my mind. The most common thing that comes up when talking about longsword length is Vadi. Vadi was roughly 80 years after Fiore, and 30 to 40 years after the Lichtenauer texts started. So I want to preface that with the recommendations for Fiore and for Lichtenauer, and even for Meyer longsword. They're not specifically in those sources. So at the core of this is the question: what is your goal in HEMA? Many of us, our goal is to recreate a historical system. So that means that we are a Fiore fencer, or we are a Lichtenauer fencer, or we're a Meyer fencer. And that goal informs not only our practice, as well as the equipment we buy and why we buy it. If your goal is to just be a modern swordsman, and I say that in quotation marks because, a fetter is not a sword. It is a training tool and it has training artifacts. The answer is going to be different depending on your goal. So just kind of zooming out from Vadi, right? Because I encourage you to take Vadi's measurements and apply it to yourself and see where it lands with the swords you have or fetters you have access to. Personally, I'm tall, and with my body proportions, taking Vadi's measurements and applying them to me results in a sword that I would consider unusable. So I don't know that's just because I don't do Vadi style longsword, or it's just that the model that Vadi used doesn't scale to people of different sizes. Who knows? We don't know. Personally, I am more concerned about recreation of a medieval knightly combat system as the primary goal. I can certainly compete in modern longsword and spar and things like that, but it's not my primary goal. What do we have to tell us about longsword lengths? We have both what we can find in writing, excluding Vadi at the moment, and then we have what we can infer from the techniques themselves. I'll start with what sources we actually have. We have writing from Pedro Monte. I believe Pedro was Spanish. Apparently, researchers are a little bit divided as to whether he was Spanish or Italian by birth. He made his career in Italy, probably attached to the court of Milan. Wrote his treatises in Latin. We know that Leonardo da Vinci used Monte, I don't know the pronunciation, as a consultant. He was a soldier himself, so he is separated from the idea of there were likely fencing masters that did not actually fight in war as a soldier. They were just like your martial arts teacher that has never seen combat type of thing. Those existed, and their goal was to sell fencing manuals. So we have Monte, and in his book, The Collection of Renaissance Military Arts and Exercises, he's very careful to point out the difference between a longsword and a two-handed sword. When speaking of a longsword, what he says is, and I'm going to read this here: the measure of weapons which we carry is to suit our strength and the way in which we draw and use them. We carry a belted sword, and it itself is kept far from the enemy. But because of the properties of the sword, it is carried, girded, and covered to keep it from injuring ourselves or another which would not be of our will. It should be of such a length that without being unbelted, it can be drawn out of the sheath and replaced in it. Therefore, long or short swords should be used in accordance with the size of the men or the length of the limbs. Stop right there. So what that's telling me is, in the context of I'm trying to recreate, reconstruct a medieval knightly combat system such as Lichtenauer or Fiore, knowing that the longsword would be used in one hand and in two hands, same sword. That's my interpretation. So, for example, if your longsword that you're training to use, you have to be able to use it from one hand on horseback, draw it from your scabbard on horseback. That's the size you need. Same with Fiore, like the same idea, right? Is that there is speculation amongst Fiorists. I'm not one of them. That Fiore is talking about different swords for different situations. That's certainly possible. Okay, so there's also the aspect of, does the sword length work with the techniques? So Fiore's system relies on beats, meaning beating the sword away, and therefore a shorter longsword is thought to be more aligned with the techniques used. The longer your sword is, the more floppy it's going to be just due to the nature of the metal. Therefore, the more difficult it is to beat a sword aside. So Fiore likes a little bit stiffer, shorter swords. Again, a generalization, my interpretation. Early Lichtenauer KDF, so much of this system is about fueling and winding and binding. Therefore, the sword's attributes of strong and weak are critical, right? And the longer you get, there starts to become this weird middle area that's neither weak nor strong, and that aspect is going to muddle your fueling. So that's one consideration. Going back to Monty, he talks about a two-handed sword, so separating it from a long sword. And Monty says a two-handed sword should be about as long as that it reaches the eyes or nose of the bearer, so that it does not touch the ground with the rising or descending blows. Though he who knows how to turn it in circles can work it widely without touching the ground. So he's telling us a two-handed sword should probably be above your nose, in your eyes. That's a pretty big sword. That's going to mean, for me, it's over 55 inches overall length. So that's kind of getting into greatsword territory, and that's what he calls a two-handed sword. There are Meyerists that say that Meyer's longsword teaches battlefield two-handed swords. Again, that's not my interpretation, not a Meyerist, but I've had Meyerists talk about that. And I'm also aware of Meyerists that say that Meyer's longsword is supposed to come up to your armpit. And again, for me, that's a 55-inch sword. I normally do my martial art of Lichtenauer's KDF with a sword that ranges from 46 to 51 inches. Once I go over like 52 inches or so, it starts to feel excessively long. Bringing it all back to close it up, it really just depends on what your goals are. The two goals of reconstruction of a martial arts system from the 15th century, knightly combat, and optimizing for modern longsword sport. Those are two extremes. Most people are going to fall somewhere in the middle there, as in most things. But just to the point is, that's why people tend to have more than one sword, because it's important that you understand the training artifacts that come from your training tools and how that applies to what your goals are. So hopefully that was helpful. Let me know if you have any questions. I will provide some resources below.